Well, welcome to today's webinar from the Open Group, which, as you can see, is being brought today by Good E-Learning. I hand over to our speaker today, Wayne Phil Matthews, a few housekeeping issues to keep today's event moving forward smoothly. First, with regards to questions, and of course, we would encourage you to submit questions to Wayne. If you'd like to ask a question of Wayne, the best way to do that is to write your question in the text QA facility. A question in there, can I ask you to address it to all participants? That one gets to see all the questions that are being asked. We will endeavour to try and answer as many questions submitted at the end of Wayne's presentation today. To share a comment with a fellow attendee, the best way to do that is to use the text chat facility. Today's event is fully recorded, so if for any reason you have to leave early or experience any local technical difficulties, and sometimes the audio can be problematical around the globe, everyone will get a link. They can access that recording. Will be sent to you via email. So, if you're happy to proceed, can I ask you to start the presentation?
Yeah, thank you. So, thanks for the introduction. So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the topic for today's webinar, which is around TOGAF 9.1 and ArchiMate 3.0 harmonization. A little bit of background from my perspective. I'm one of the distinguished architects with the Open Group as a profession lead, so OpenCA Level 3. Previously the architect and consultant role owner at Microsoft, as well as other roles with Accenture and head of global architecture for large investment banks, and a broad history of architecture over the last 30 years. So thank you for the Open Group for allowing me to come and present today on this particular subject. Your wish is my command. Oh, I've got Siri in the background now also talking to me, which is great. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Just do a quick sound check, just make sure everyone can hear me okay. Okay. Today's subject, like the title states, is ArchiMate 3 harmonization, which is specifically a topic area that I know has been covered in some of the previous webinars, specifically around how ArchiMate is further aligned to the TOGAF 9.1 framework. What I wanted to do for this particular webinar is just to bring everybody up to speed in regard to some of the work that the Open Group are doing around the harmonization project in terms of updating the work that was previously done in ArchiMate 2 and TOGAF 9.1 harmonization, and just to bring to bear in this particular webinar that those elements that are obviously important in terms of the priority changes that were made. We don't have enough time to spend going through every single one of the harmonization areas, but we'll touch upon some of those considerations that were specific in the creation and sort of the journey that ArchiMate's gone over the last few years. I'm saying that they can't hear me. I just better do a quick sanity check just to make sure that people can still hear. Okay. I shall continue. Great. Okay, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for that. There'll always be some areas that are not going to get that audio quality, as Simon states, as good as some. So we'll carry on, and Simon will keep us honest in regards to any audio issues that we face. So TOGAF 1 and ArchiMate 2.1 in terms of the harmonization project, we started to look at this in terms of pulling this particular webinar together. A lot of architects and a lot of those that are practicing architecture really are not aware of the harmonization program of work that took place towards the end of 2014 in terms of its publication. So I thought we'd start today just to give a background in terms of what the harmonization project looked at specifically when it comes to correlation between TOGAF 9.1 and the development of ArchiMate 3.0 and some of the background around that. So there were sort of four main project areas that Project Harm looked at. One was glossary harmonization. There was content meta-model harmonization. The third being the relationships in regards to notation and language harmonization. And obviously an important area from an ArchiMate perspective was around the viewpoint harmonization. So how did they correlate and correspond with each other in terms of how ArchiMate was being progressed from a modeling language, and how did that tie back into TOGAF 9.1? Key areas here, just before we get started, is obviously that call out. The TOGAF is a framework, whereas ArchiMate is that modeling language and notation. And the reason I call that out is when people talk about integration and correlation back to TOGAF specifically, it's something for those that are practicing architecture really to keep in the back of their mind in relation to the considerations, the broader scope of TOGAF versus the actual communication considerations that ArchiMate is trying to address in an organization. The project themselves, the papers are available via the Open Group website, and I've provided links in the webinar for those that want to go into a little bit more depth after the short time that we have together today in this particular webinar. That will give you some of the depth considerations around each topic area. I am going to present some of those examples to you in today's session, but I would recommend for those that want to get a little bit more familiarity with the project itself, but also the outcomes that were developed for 2.1, to go and have a look at these particular white papers if you haven't already done so. So again, we're going to have a mixed audience in regards to these webinars, so I just wanted to set the scene. Apologies for those that are sort of deep in ArchiMate and have been deep in ArchiMate for a number of years, but really what we want to ensure that everyone understands the need that ArchiMate 3.0 serves. That obviously enterprise architecture enables the business and supporting IT systems to effectively achieve business goals. It's common understanding in regards to that. Really, what we're trying to do is enable that tooling, both from a communication perspective. Also, my experience as the roles that I've done over the last 10 years specifically is around that consistency of language. So this particular area around harmonization was important to me because it becomes one of those sort of disrupting considerations that allows us to really get to the business outcomes that obviously we're trying to achieve from an architectural perspective, both at the enterprise level as well as the technology level sort of outcomes as well from an execution perspective. So again, to create an effective EA, architects still must develop defined requirements. And again, we're not going to go into the discussion today around agile and storyboarding and journeys. We'll leave that to a separated webinar. But really what we're trying to do is understand the business concerns and how we're going to address those business concerns at a high level. Cohesive, integrated, but loosely coupled layers of architecture. One of the things that ArchiMate 3, and we'll give some examples and some discussion around the technology layer, specifically when it comes to TOGAF and ArchiMate 3.1 integration. So there's been some great work done by the Open Group and by the ArchiMate forum in regards to more closely aligning TOGAF and ArchiMate to allow us to communicate more effectively things, some of the latest trends. So when we look at big data, when we look at IoT, we'll give some examples of that cohesion and harmonization between TOGAF 9.1 and 3.0 and those elements that were introduced to bridge that gap. Formal descriptions, obviously, from an architectural perspective that support reasoning about the structural and behavioral properties of a solution. So we're going to touch upon, as we go through the webinar, those considerations from a viewpoints perspective. So we'll look upon how TOGAF 9.1 supports IEEE 1471 and 42010 from an ISO perspective, and how the structural elements of architecture need to be considered at the enterprise level, but also how ArchiMate leverages the viewpoints and the viewpoints library that ArchiMate is also providing to tie some of those considerations back into some more modern architectural considerations, not only at the platform level but also at the strategy level. Visualization of architectural descriptions, again, I'm a traditional architect in terms of I'm not a purist architect. and we're not going to get into that discussion today around ArchiMate versus BPMN versus UML, because actually they're all supporting each other in terms of communication and visualization. But one of the things that I've always been a strong advocate for, and again, ArchiMate 3 in its latest form ports is, there's only really two reasons we model in the first place. One is modeling to understand, and then secondary is modeling to communicate. And purist perspective, when it comes to architecture, I advocate that modeling to understand can be done in any modeling form or notation. I tend to use ArchiMate and UML together just because I'm familiar with those processes and concepts behind them. But when it comes to architecting and modeling to communicate, then having that consistency at a taxonomy layer helps an organization structure communications to the effective stakeholders to ensure that those addressable concerns are being met when it comes to a communication perspective. So modeling to understand, I'm not really a purist, but when it comes to modeling to communicate, there are obviously benefits to having some sort of consistency in the modeling language that's being used. And again, we'll highlight through the webinar how 3.0 has sort of built upon its previous iterations to help architects do that communication as well. And then also, ArchiMate is enabling supporting these tasks by defining a lightweight, broadly understandable model language for creating uniform and integrated visualizations of the essential EA domains. So again, rather than starting from scratch, which I've seen a lot of architects do, when it comes to modeling itself, is the structure that ArchiMate is continuing to provide in ArchiMate 3 also helps architects from that communication perspective as well. So, for those that are not sort of spent a number of years in this particular main area, hopefully that gives you some context of the need that ArchiMate 3 is addressing. Obviously, the importance of architectural description. The architectural drawing of a classical building describes the various aspects of the construction. ArchiMate offers a common language, and that goes to the bit of the consistency concern that I mentioned a moment ago. Provides a common language for describing the construction operation across the boundaries of the enterprise architectural consideration. So again, 3 doesn't change that. In terms of the release of 3.0, what it's actually doing is adding additional viewpoints and layers that enable that rich communication to be extended. It's not that we haven't been able to do it in ArchiMate 2. It's just not been consistent in terms of the ability to do it very easily. We've always had the ability to extend the graphical representation. What ArchiMate 3 has now allowed us to do is to do this in a templated manner with the support of the language that sits beneath it. And that's been really helpful from those that are obviously familiar with using ArchiMate, but those that are coming straight into ArchiMate 3, you'll find it a little bit more modern, not only in its relationship to TOGAF 9.1, but also around the considerations on some of those concerns that need to be addressed both from an enterprise architecture perspective and also at the solution architectural perspective as well. So important areas. ArchiMate 3's key characteristics, again, nothing too drastically different than what they were in 2, except the better alignment of the TOGAF standard itself. And again, the premise of this webinar is to look at some of those areas and call out some high-level areas where similarities have been matured, but also just to call out a few gotchas and a couple of things that I highlighted as I went through the research for this particular webinar in terms of value. So I'll call out both the goods and the bads because I think it helps you then steer that path from a pattern perspective in regards to making this real when it comes to execution of the language and notation within your own organizations as well. So to say, not really many differences in terms of the key characteristics of 3. It's still simple yet comprehensive for most enterprise architecture work. It still supports service orientation in all architectural layers. The additional is also have extended the considerations around topic areas like microservices, and we'll touch upon those when we get to the particular additions that have been included into ArchiMate 3.0. Again, still providing a graphical language standard to define the appropriate levels of detail for each layer, describes the EA evolution over time, so transformation, migration, and planning, so everything from current state, transition state to target state, as well as describing the motivation and rationale behind those elements. So again, it's not just about communicating the what. Obviously, good enterprise architectural practices communicate the why. And I find that ArchiMate 3, specifically at the enterprise architectural level, also does a great job of providing the why decisions have been made in the architectural life cycle, rather than just what I see in a lot of organizations, even mature organizations, they concentrate on the artifact of the what and the journey of the why. So again, ArchiMate 3 has extended that consideration in its latest form. The architectural ArchiMate, the three main architectural layers are defined in the ArchiMate language, and this again, when we compare this to TOGAF 9.1, is the layers still remain the same in terms of language. So we still have the business layer, we still have the application layer, and we still have the technology layer, where in TOGAF 9.1 we still have the business layer, the data layer, the application layer, and the technology layer. The consideration here in ArchiMate, I'm getting a couple of people saying my voice is gone. If others can let me know whether you can still hear me, probably not if you can't hear me, that would be useful as well. But the technology layer and the application layer, the considerations for the ArchiMate harmonization and correlation back to TOGAF 9.1 are also have been more closely aligned. So again, we're not changing the language structure. Thanks to those for letting me know that you can still hear me. I appreciate it. The key here is TOGAF 9.1 is a mature framework. ArchiMate is continued to bring that closer alignment to TOGAF 9.1, and you'll see further enhancements as the iterations around the harmonization project work more closely with later releases of TOGAF and also basically the later releases of ArchiMate as well. But for ArchiMate 3, the language definition is still the same in regards to the considerations that were in 2.1. The point that we wanted to get to, as in we wanted to set the context in regards to just ArchiMate and the concerns that the ArchiMate addresses. The fundamental reasons behind ArchiMate and modeling notation and language still remain the same. You know, everything changes in architecture, but nothing actually changes. And really what ArchiMate 3 is doing is extending its capability and keeping up with some of those considerations that you see in the industry and within the profession of architecture today. And I think that was one of the biggest comments when we looked at ArchiMate 2.1 and TOGAF 9.1, is that the gap or the chasm between the two was significant. Look at 3.0 and the specification of 3.0 now, that chasm has significantly reduced. It hasn't gone, there is still gaps in the consideration, but actually the ability for enterprise architects to communicate more consistently has been addressed within ArchiMate 3.0. So why did ArchiMate 3.0 come about, and what were the sort of key requirements and responses to the need of enterprise architects and those practicing architecture to develop and extend ArchiMate further in 3.0. A new version of ArchiMate has been created to respond to these requirements. So increasing demand for relating business strategy with business and IT operations. Again, the world has changed significantly. It hasn't changed in terms of the technology outcomes that both business, whether it's public sector, private sector, or whatever mix of that business that you're in, the demand for tying back business strategy with technology outcomes is still there. But obviously that change for technology to be the driver of innovation is the significant conversation that a lot of us are probably having in regards to the changes that have taken place over the last 4 or 5 years. One of the things that is also addressed to some degree in ArchiMate 3.0 from a harmonization perspective is new approaches when we look at things like DevOps. So, for example, in the new world where DevOps and Agile are becoming more and more the common in terms of the approach, the considerations of modeling consistency when we want to provide DevOps teams autonomy to select their notational language is obviously a key concern, specifically at the architectural layer. So when we look at the engineering layer, we want to provide some guidance around what they should be autonomous in those teams, but also what the taxonomy of a DevOps team should look like when it comes to things like this. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is, as we've said previously, is not only addressing the what, but it's also addressing the why. And when you get to that point where your DevOps teams are providing velocity in terms of features, in terms of outcomes, then the world changes significantly in terms of the ability to provide taxonomy consistency. Not again a topic for this particular webinar, but it's something that ArchiMate 3.0 is also starting to address when it comes to modeling notation and language to provide the understanding of the what in the ability of those architects that work alongside DevOps teams to highlight and reduce risk, to increase velocity because the consistency is there, and not become the barrier point in terms of what architecture has always been as, which is slowing down the velocity of engineering teams at scale. I know it's not always the case in all organizations, but that's still the view within industry and in a lot of organizations that I work with and have worked with over the last 30 years, but specifically over the last 4 or 5 years, where velocity has become a key metric for innovation in a lot of organizations. So using new domains has also been addressed in ArchiMate 3. There was a comment in regards to, for example, manufacturing and logistics was often a complicated domain from a national perspective in regards to modeling, and it was apparent that there was a gap in 2.1 of ArchiMate to ensure that those other domains were brought in. Again, wasn't impossible to do, it was just more complicated to do in those domains. So ArchiMate has kindly addressed those considerations, specifically manufacturing and logistics as 2 examples. In consistency and comprehensibility, again, there's been some definition changes, and we'll talk about those in a moment. Improvement in the consistency and comprehensibility between TOGAF as a framework and how you model those considerations that come out of the architectural development method specifically within the framework have also been matured within ArchiMate 3.0 as well. Really just alignment across the open group standards, and again the topic of this particular area is looking at the TOGAF 9.1 harmonization considerations that are being included in ArchiMate 3.0. Language consistency versus addressing architectural concern. Like I mentioned, really model for two reasons, and I'll give prizes out to anybody in the chat window at the end of the session that can give me any other reason apart from modeling to understand and modeling to communicate in terms of why we actually model. I'm yet to find somebody that can come up with a third reason. Really that's what we're ultimately trying to do with ArchiMate 3. And for those organizations that have adopted TOGAF as a framework, and I don't mean taking TOGAF out of the box as it was never intended to do, but taking the thought process and the mindset that TOGAF encourages in an organization in terms of process and consideration, and providing that language consistency when it comes to ArchiMate modeling. And you'll see the benefits of ArchiMate 3 in terms of that language consistency as it's been developed in the latest form. So consistency is always important to me from a communication perspective, not necessarily from a modeling perspective, only the communication perspective. And then addressing architecture concern is ultimately when we model to communicate, and also modeling to understand, is we're trying ultimately from a notation and language perspective to have consistency, but also ensuring that the notation and modeling language that we use has enough detail for the right audience at the right time, at the right level to communicate effectively. And that's really why I put this particular slide into the webinar today. Was really, for me, it's about language consistency and addressing architecture concerns. So we're going to focus on those areas a little bit as we go into the alignment for TOGAF, TOGAF 9.1 alignment. So when we look at the ArchiMate harmonization that's taken place, you'll obviously see this diagram, this representation of the considerations between the two frameworks and ArchiMate specifically. And we'll count out some of those changes that have been incorporated that bring the two framework and language and notation closer together. So the two standards still complement each other with respect to definition of the development process and the definition of an enterprise architecture modeling language. And that's really the key. So we haven't really stripped anything away. What we've done is we've added and changed things from an ArchiMate viewpoint that allows us to ensure that the complementation between the two is still maintained. The two standards overlap in their, for example, their use of viewpoints and the concepts of an underlying repository of architectural artifacts, as in they have a firm common foundation. So if for those that are familiar with TOGAF 9.1, and we go all the way back to things such as the enterprise continuum and the solutions continuum as classification mechanisms before you actually get to the physical repositories for artifacts, is what ArchiMate is allowing you to do at an enterprise architectural level within the framework is tie back to those artifacts that TOGAF is recommending as part of its continuum framework within TOGAF itself within the ADM. Also actually creating the ability to pre-populate that repository from some of the viewpoints that are already defined and created and are part of the ArchiMate 3.0 language and notation. So it's important to call that out in terms of when you're tying both the framework and the modeling language together. Is one of the questions that I'm often asked is what is, specifically if you're teaching TOGAF or you're teaching ArchiMate or any modeling language, what is the minimum set of artifacts that need to be created to start an architecture, but also that need to be maintained throughout the architectural life cycle. So again, I'm doing a piece of work at the moment as an example. Asked for the individual architects involved in Scrum today to show me their architectural representation. And what I get is inconsistency a lot of the time in terms of I'll get some just show me a sequence diagram, as in they've done the business process analysis, but they've just shown me a sequence diagram. If I look at the excuse I sometimes hear around, well, we're agile and we do storyboarding and we take the stories and the stories are our requirements. And it's great at an engineering level to do that, but actually when you look at regulatory and compliancy and the requirements around traceability, this consideration around the two, around the framework, the artifact repository and the continuum classification of what needs to be captured through the architectural life cycle, and then the actual considerations that ArchiMate's providing for you as an organization, as an individual architect, to get up to speed quickly. We tie those three things together in ArchiMate 3, you have a much richer foundation to answer that question, what is the minimum set of artifacts that need to be created in the architectural life cycle. So ArchiMate 3 has done a great job of bringing TOGAF as a framework closer together to answering some of the more core and common questions that architecture needs to consider through its life cycle as well. And then the combined use of the two standards can support better communications between the stakeholders. So again, once you have that understanding at the framework level of TOGAF 9.1 as it currently stands, and then apply ArchiMate understanding in conjunction with TOGAF 9.1, there are subsequent gaps that get filled. TOGAF will talk to you and help you create the high-level framework and the mindset and the approach to do outcomes-based and value-based and benefits-driven enterprise architecture. But also it's about how you communicate the value of architecture in terms of the relevant stakeholders. The second most asked question that I often get, but both sitting on architectural boards and as the professional lead within organizations like Microsoft, is what is the value in terms of architecture? It's a question that I often ask architects that go through the OpenC process. Also, in terms of it becomes one of the biggest blockers for architecture in a domain specifically, because unless you can communicate that value to the relevant stakeholder and you're addressing those concerns, is actually architecture has no value in an organization from a perception perspective, which can be extremely dangerous. So ArchiMate and TOGAF together allow you a method and an approach to actually communicate value, and to go when they're combined together, they give you a much richer, stronger argument to communicate that value back to the relevant stakeholders at the relevant point in time with the relevant level of detail. And really, now that we've integrated strategy, for example, so you'll see strategy and motivation together. Strategy was not part of 2.1. You could model it, but it didn't form part of the language consideration or the viewpoint consideration that's been introduced into ArchiMate 3.0. Now, for example, the strategy has been included in that. We can really have that conversation at the strategy level, and not just at the outcome level. So again, enterprise architecture has always been focused on the strategy of an organization and helping technology from an enablement perspective, as well as creating innovation for those organizations is move that strategy forward. The interesting thing was obviously 2.1 didn't really have much vocabulary of strategy, and including that in ArchiMate 3.0 has also helped to bridge that gap as well. So we'll do a little bit of this in terms of the consideration. So when we look at the full ArchiMate framework, you'll see a couple of areas here. So the full ArchiMate language is described in this version of the standard. It adds a number of layers and an aspect to the framework. So a couple of areas were added. And the physical elements build upon the technology layer and add elements for modeling physical facilities and equipment, distribution networks and materials. So strategy was added, and the physical considerations were added to the ArchiMate framework itself. The reason for that, in regards to strategy we've just discussed, but in regards to the physical layer, there was a gap in terms of implementation, migration, and technology. And when we look at the architectural development method that sits within in the ADM, when we look at things such as opportunities and solutions and technology architecture, and again you can overlap the technology architecture layer here in terms of the consideration with the ADM in action of those opportunities. It was very difficult in ArchiMate previously to tie architectural building blocks and solution building blocks into the actual notation itself. So we had the ability to represent physical elements, but actually we have a much richer vocabulary now in ArchiMate 3.1, and the ability to communicate specifically when we look at things like IoT and in an interconnected world that were difficult to notate in ArchiMate 2.1. So again, strategy and physical were the added elements. A couple of notational considerations here. So for example, resource, capability, and course of action were notational elements that were added into here. So always what we're trying to think about when we think about ArchiMate and TOGAF 9.1 integration is where does the actual layer sit in regards to TOGAF itself, but also how do we represent that from a modeling communication perspective when we actually create these notational languages to communicate. Strategy and the motivation element. So again, there's elements around outcome, which was added into ArchiMate 3.1. So that's a new element that was added that wasn't in there. Actually, when we look at, for example, TOGAF 9.1, is we could have much more richer conversations within TOGAF around outcome, specifically in the the business and the vision stages, as well as in the preliminary stages. But obviously, what we couldn't do is effectively model from a notational perspective in ArchiMate 2.1. So outcome has been added as an element in 2.1. Capability, which we'll look a little bit more in a moment, but capability has been added as well into ArchiMate 3.1. And capability was probably one of the major areas that was lacking, specifically when we focus at an enterprise architectural level and what the framework talks about in 9.1 around capabilities. So we have capability architectures that are talked at length within the TOGAF, but again, it was missing from a vocabulary and a notation perspective in ArchiMate 3.1, and that's been introduced to complete that. Resource again has been added in regard to the IT resource or human resources in the example given here, and call action again added in to 3.1. So often we went straight from sort of the notational direction in terms of relationships between each one of the components. There was always a gap between goal in some instances and actually the hurt and influence relationships that were in place to communicate what the goal should be. So there was a gap between the courses of action that needed to take place to get to the goal. So we did consider it in ArchiMate 2.1. We had current state, transition state, and target state, but there was always a gap when we wanted to communicate from a layering perspective in terms of what the courses of actions need to be done. And remember what we said, as if we're doing modeling to communicate the why, then obviously the course of action gives those that are consuming from a communication perspective more clarity in the decisions that we've made based on the courses of actions that we've taken in regards to creating the architectures that drive those technology strategies. Again, these were added in 3.1 to provide a richer conversation that we in TOGAF 9.1, but we found difficult to notate from a consistency perspective in 2.1 of ArchiMate. Capabilities, again, the reason I'm including these in here because obviously the audience is broad on the webinar, and it's not to teach you capabilities, but highlight that real difference when we look at the correlation back to the framework and TOGAF is this area was often missed. So again, capabilities have been introduced to really address those areas and consideration. So here we have capability, resource, course of action that I've just mentioned. Outcome, which is interesting. One of the things that we often hear when we're either teaching ArchiMate or whether we're having conversations is around the outcomes that our architectures are ultimately trying to achieve. The outcome element is one of those important ones that has been addressed in 3.1 because actually we can now model that from a framework perspective because it's considered within TOGAF 9.1. There'll be further developments, I'm assuming, around the iterations of ArchiMate. So, for example, human-centric design and customer first, and some of the new considerations around architecture. You also find those can be modeled more effectively now that we have an outcome notation, as well as the supporting language that sits beneath it in delivering that from a communication perspective and from a modeling to understand perspective in the models that we create and communicate. Metric, again, is another interesting one. It was very difficult when we talk about metrics, and we'll talk about the content framework in a moment. But metrics was introduced and is the specialization of the driver element. So we could take what the driver and the driver of a particular architecture was aiming to achieve in the notational language. But it was very difficult to notate that combination of them both when it comes to the metric. So, for example, when we have metric and outcome together, obviously that provides much richer conversation and communication than we were able to do previously. Just we couldn't do it previously. Just the introduction of capabilities allows us to do it in a more consistent way. And then capability increment in regards to it. So no specific notation, uses the notation of capability all up as you see on the top. So that's another bridge that's been closed with 3.0 between TOGAF 9.1 and 3.0 itself. New ways to present the physical layer. This was all challenged, so material, facility, equipment, and distribution network have also been included. Again, you could talk about these in TOGAF as part of the consideration within the framework itself. So when you were looking in technology, for example, and buildings, architectural building blocks and solution building blocks, is you would look at, as you went through the ADM cycle, you had very difficult when it comes to some domain specifics to tie them from a layering perspective in the notational consideration to a specific area within the domain. So what's happened at the physical layer is we now have that ability, specifically in manufacturing and logistics as an example here, where you can actually tie that notational consideration together. So it's not only building architectural building blocks that are based on generic architectural concerns. Also now allows us to go down a layer from a physical perspective to these types of considerations. So they were in TOGAF, and you could have that rich conversation about them. But what you couldn't do if you were using ArchiMate is to have consistency from a communication perspective in what the notation looks like. Saying ArchiMate 3 has added that notational consideration into ArchiMate 3.0 to make it much easier to represent that in the notation viewpoints that we're trying to address the concerns of. So some of the areas, again, the documentation around ArchiMate 2.1 and 3 is quite rich and continues to develop. And I'm not going to go through all the changes in ArchiMate 2.1 and 3.0. The introduction or specification, the introduction to the ArchiMate specification 3.0, written by Andrew Josie, will in Section E will give you that information from an informative perspective, some of the changes that have taken place. The ones that I did want to call out specifically in relation to the content model harmonization project was just to give an introduction of how and why it was considered. So when we look at the content framework as an example, is the various elements when we look at the harmonization project, like we talked about glossaries, we talked about interaction with the TOGAF ADM, and they're broken down in the Harmony project to do a one-to-one mapping of glossary definition, consideration, concern. One of the areas is when we look at things such as the architecture content framework. The architecture content framework, for those that may not be familiar, is a part of the ADM that considers those areas that sit within the ADM itself and the structure of the artifacts that get created within them. So here on the left-hand side we see the ADM, and on the right-hand side we see the high-level architectural content framework that looks at everything from the preliminary phase and phase A all the way through to architecture realization from a phase H perspective. And in each one of those sections we have some considerations that we need to really think about. Some of them are around the artifacts that we create, but also it's about the definitions in terms of consistency. So it's really about the building blocks that are relevant in the context of the ADM. ArchiMate modeling language offers precisely defined concepts that include graphical notation to represent many of those building blocks. So a lot of the Harmony work in 2.1 was done to highlight what those differences were, and then how to apply them in 3.0 to ensure that the definitions remained consistent in most cases. But there are interesting findings even when I looked at the Harmony project documentation that came out of it. When we see, for example, the full content meta model, so the addition of the core components when we look at the meta model itself, but also colored components here are the extension elements. And the extension elements are interesting. And the reason that they're interesting is because, for the part, they were difficult to notate from a notational perspective in 2.1. Also, they were difficult from a language perspective to pull them together in those core architectures that we create There is a couple of things just as gotchas though, and it's not an apology to the open group in terms of delivering a webinar for them, but it is helpful to call out some of these considerations. So, for example, in ArchiMate 3.1, the motivation extension that we see up here in terms of this one. Motivation extension itself has been renamed in ArchiMate 3.0 to motivation elements and introduced a new outcome element in its own right. So again, whilst the consistency has been applied broadly, until we get to later release of TOGAF, you're not going to see some of the alignment fully. And the reason I say that is obviously what's happened in ArchiMate 3, specifically just for motivation extension, is motivation extension is now motivation elements, but in TOGAF 9.1 it'll still be called motivation extension. So we reversed a little bit in terms of the harmony between the language and the framework itself. The good news is that very minimum across the new definitions that sit within ArchiMate 3.0. I've done the analysis of all the harmonization documentation, and there's only one or two where that type of inconsistency in terms of new changes that were introduced in ArchiMate 3 actually are counterproductive to TOGAF 9.1. But it's just things like that to call out, which are important for you to understand when it comes to understanding the changes that have been made. So obviously, from a content perspective, the specification uses the ACF is optional. So again, in the ACF, you don't have to use this at all. It's nothing in TOGAF is prescribed. Other content frameworks such as DODAF or Zachman, and as well as other modeling languages, can be used in place of the TOGAF ACF. Again, just something to consider when we're talking about harmonization is we're talking about harmonization here between ArchiMate 3.0 and TOGAF 9.1. When you look at harmonization between those other frameworks in terms of content frameworks that you may be adhering to and the mod languages that are in use, then obviously the complication between harmonization is magnified. So again, just something to call out to consider. The comparator models that were taking place in the previous harmonization project, again, each of the harmonization projects had a different way of highlighting the differences between them, and you'll see that when we go through this as the last part of the webinar. But the matrices were rated in terms of how closely, specifically for the meta model, were rated on strong fit, fair fit, and weak fit. And this just gives you an example from the previous harmonization project, the Harmony project that took place, where we had things such as business object. So business object was identified as a fair fit. The TOGAF element was called data entity. The ArchiMate element was called business object. So this gives a highlight of the level that the Open Group team and the ArchiMate forum have gone into in regards to mapping both the ArchiMate element and TOGAF element. And when speaking to the ArchiMate forum lead, this update at this level is currently work in progress. So again, keep an eye out for the updates to the Harmony project that will provide you this level of understanding. We wouldn't have time in an hour's webinar to go through each one of these, but it's really just to hopefully help you, to understand the major differences between ArchiMate 3 and the intents behind it in terms of TOGAF correlation, but also to provide you a point of reference that if you want to go through in terms of glossaries for an understanding or the content meta model in terms of relationship, you have a point to go to consume that information. The good news is in regards to my analysis and research and background into the sort of four Harmony projects that took place, it wasn't a great deal of weak fit or fit. The majority was strong fit or no correlation. So that was my highlight, which was for the large part there was simply in 2.1 a lack of correlation, and that level of research from the Open Group has obviously allowed it to create the updates and the roadmap for ArchiMate 3.1 in relation to TOGAF 9.1, and keep them much more closely aligned moving forward. So again, look out for updates to the Harmony project documentation. Core TOGAF and ArchiMate extension and alignment, like I say, when we look at the artifacts that TOGAF recommends, and it comes back to that conversation in terms of what are the minimum set of artifacts needed, then understanding what TOGAF provides to you as core artifacts is important, because the corresponding viewpoint or notational consideration will also help you to provide tighter integration with these particular artifact extensions and alignment within TOGAF. Again, I mentioned earlier, we've always been able to do this in 2.1, and profiling is still available in 3.0. So I suppose to enrich ArchiMate concepts and relationship in a generic way is to add the supplementary information by means of profiling. So if you don't see things that are either a strong fit within the definition within the Harmony project, then ability to profile either predefined profiles or user-defined profiles still allow you in the last part to create the notation and supporting communication via the language of ArchiMate itself, but via the tooling. So for those toolings that support ArchiMate 3, in terms of that specification alignment, they will also have that ability to allow you to profile within the language, and that's important to understand, because that in the 3.0 specification, we would have been really taking away an element of closer alignment to TOGAF 9.1, because a lot of the time profiling has filled those gaps. The key from an ArchiMate perspective is to use less profiling, because it becomes more inconsistent across industry. So when we think of enterprise architecture and business to business, is that communication can often extend beyond your own organization. So again, it's in there in the 3.0 specification, but it's really there to address the gaps between the framework and the notational language itself. Harmonization, so again, was created for the usage and understanding of terms from either the TOGAF standard or the ArchiMate standard, to support better communication with EA stakeholders, both inside and, as I mentioned just a moment ago, outside of organizations. Again, this is supporting the Open Group's vision of boundaryless information flow in regards to the ultimate aim when it comes to creating enterprise architecture. What you'll find here is the inconsistency that I talked about. So again, just another recommendation going back into the ArchiMate forum team is here. They have a different key to represent the differences. So where we have key fit, no fit, or weak fit in one Harmony document, here we have represents no correspondence, represents different definitions, and represents the same definitions. So don't get too muddled up in regards to the mapping status. Just be aware of it, that they are slightly different, because it's quite easily, if you're not sure, you could misinterpret from a key perspective in the current Harmony program documentation. Okay, again, organized entity, just some examples here. The same for harmonization when we talk about views and viewpoints and IEEE 1471 and the 42010 standard that we show here. Views and viewpoints are obviously a key element of both TOGAF and ArchiMate, so they're both using that as I like to call it the grandfather of architecture from a considerations perspective. Viewpoint mechanisms in 3.0, so again, a generic model, meta model has been added, but it's taking the view and viewpoint consideration the same as what TOGAF does. And again, we're not using the webinar to teach views and viewpoints, but really just to show you that the mechanisms that sit behind have been extended in 3.0 to provide tighter coupling with TOGAF 9.1 view and viewpoint considerations. Completed in 2.1, again, the key was slightly different. In terms of actually, so there was no color coding in regards to it, but actually the ADM phase here, for example, introductory viewpoint in TOGAF 9.1, the artifact was a solution concept diagram. In ArchiMate 2.1, the actual artifact is an introductory viewpoint. So the catalog of viewpoints that are provided in 3.0 were slightly different to 2.1. There has been some work to update those. It's not fully complete, but again, a lot of work has been done to update the harmony considerations in terms of providing that consistency between the two, specifically for views and viewpoints. As in, a lot of architects will use the richness that are provided in ArchiMate from those views and viewpoints libraries that are provided as part of the ArchiMate language, in some ways as a starting point, but often even taking the catalog and using that as their defined artifacts. Again, if you're involved in the creation of an enterprise architectural framework, you're starting from a blank piece of paper, and sort of allows you to do that at scale. We come up to the sort of last 5 minutes. Really the key findings in regards to harmonization between 9.1 of TOGAF, the framework, and ArchiMate 3.0 from a modeling perspective is the two standards still do complement each other really well with respect to definition and development process, as well as definition of the enterprise architecture modeling language. That's important because that's the whole premise of the reason behind continuing to develop ArchiMate and its iterations. There's overlap in their use of viewpoints and the concept of an underlying common repository of architectural artifacts and models. Foundation of enterprise architecture is still very much complementary between TOGAF 9.1 and ArchiMate 3.0, as in they both stem from architectural practices that don't slow down innovation and outcome. And that's important, specifically when we look at the perception of architecture and our ability to communicate that effectively in terms of the reasons that we do it in the first place. Again, as mentioned throughout the webinar, combined use support better communication, but there's still some effort required to model where there is not a natural harmony between TOGAF and ArchiMate. So ArchiMate 3 still provides that in the ways that it does it, but the flexibility of ArchiMate and new notation additions just make it much easier to address those architecture concerns. So that, I know I haven't left much time for questions, but that in terms of the content, hopefully you found that useful. It was definitely useful for me in regards to getting a better understanding of how the Harmony project and the development and the additions of the language and notation have been developed further. Like I say, there will be updates to the Harmony project once that work is completed, so keep an eye out for those particular websites. To pop in how he wants to do the questions and answers, just because I haven't left a great deal of time.
Well, thank you very much. That's really interesting and timely insight there. Thank you a lot for that. Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes, so let me just pick out a few questions that we have the QA facility. So I'll just start one from Antonio. Antonio is asking, is it intention for this harmonization project to use ArchiMate as the language to describe TOGAF content and meta model? He says, like we see in the IT for IT standard.
Oh, great question. So actually, I would have to refer that to the ArchiMate forum lead. I don't want to say things that are out of line in terms. I can give you my opinion, but actually, because I'll take that one offline and ask rather than give the wrong answer. I can see why we would want to do that, but I'm not sure whether that's been agreed or not agreed at this stage.
Okay, that's fine, Wayne. A question here from Mike. He says, how exactly are relationships between foundation, systems, industry, and organization-specific architectures used and maintained in practice in the enterprise continuum or in ArchiMate 3.0? I'm going to give you from end to end. That's quite a long answer. Let me try and simplify it just in the time that we've got. Is when we're looking at the continuum. That's just I try to simplify in terms of the classification mechanism of the artifacts that we need to create in a given enterprise. And again, that'll be industry, organization, specific. Heavily regulated, you may have to create more artifacts than an organization that is less regulated, as an example. So that's one area, is the classification
is dependent. The top in terms of the relationship between layers and consideration is also in terms of, if you look at the relationship language in terms of what you can and can't do in terms of joining those layers together, the language is enforcing some of that. So for example, one of the things that's happened in ArchiMate 3.0 is the use by relationship has been changed to serving relationship. So it was renamed because actually when you looked at how to tie those manufacturing and technology layers together, is when you use the word used by, it was misconstrued in the communication, whereas actually what we try to do now is because of the rename, is we're saying they're serving across layers. So those elements within the language that help to address that, but actually the broader consideration is it is dependent upon industry, artifact requirements within the industry, the classification that's been agreed in the setup of the enterprise architecture framework, building blocks that are commonly used from an architectural building block perspective to the tie-up to the solution building block perspective. When you look at those counterparts in ArchiMate specifically, is what you're trying to do is you're trying to balance the relationships between each layer. So actually you have that full picture of why you're doing something and not the what. So now that we've introduced strategy and we've introduced the technology layer, we can actually address in the communication the why we actually chose a particular technology set from a solution building block perspective. What was the strategy in terms of the technology enabler that allowed us to do that? It's providing a richer content to tie those layers together.
And I picked a good question to end on.
You did. Everything in architecture, it depends.
Anyway, we have just gone over our time, so this would be a good time to end.
Great.
I do note that we have questions in the QA, so if it's okay with you, I'll share those with you. Please. And take those offline.
Absolutely. Thank you, Simon.
Fantastic. Well, we do have a common request. Getting copies of your slides, Wayne. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I'll speak to the powers that be in terms of sharing it, and then I'll come back to you, Simon, in regards to probably PDF formatted, and then we can send them out to you. But I don't see that's going to be a problem.
That'd be fantastic. So everyone, if there's anyone out there that were to send me an email just registering your interest in slides, then please go ahead and do that. I mean, do you have final words before we close?
No, thank you, buddy, for the questions. Always appreciated in terms of concern and consideration. Feedback again is always useful as you start to use ArchiMate and apply it from a 3 specification. Feedback to the ArchiMate forum, and I'll try to answer the questions that came up. But thank you for listening to me for an hour. Always appreciated.
And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll catch with you in future webinars. Many thanks and goodbye.